Hi students, today I am going to discuss a previous year question, and that is the impact of the French Revolution on the English Romantic poets, or the influence of the French Revolution. So this is a question which can cover a lot many questions which can come in the examination. And to make you understand that, see, here it is written romantic poets, means there can be Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Byron, Coleridge, and there are so many romantic poets. But especially for this question, I will teach you Wordsworth, means I'll take one poet in detail to give you a better edge, a better understanding of the question. And once, if you have to write accordingly, you can take other poets as well with the two-liners of those poets, the poems which you might have read. Fine. So see, the important word here is the French Revolution. We all know that this term or this word, the French Revolution, and the movement or whatever happened, that actually stirred, हिला दिया इसको कहते हैं, STIRRED, stirred the whole of Europe. This French Revolution, this stirred whole of Europe to its depth, बहुत गहराई तक, and left a powerful impact, a powerful impression on the romantic poets of England. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron, they were all very deeply influenced by the revolution, and their poetic works were colored by the ideals and the revolutionary fervor. Revolutionary को हिंदी में कहते हैं क्रांतिकारी. And their poetic works were basically colored, उसको कलर किया गया था by the ideals and the revolutionary fervor of the revolutionists of France. And the French Revolution, in its first aspects, left Wordsworth tranquil and almost unconcerned, for it seemed to him the most natural thing in the world. जैसे the cry of liberty, the cry of liberty of equality, of fraternity, did not come to him as a surprise. To whom, students? To Wordsworth. The cry of liberty, of equality, of fraternity did not come to him as a surprise. And his youth had been passed in societies where equality was accepted as a matter of course. So, the revolution, the French Revolution, in its earlier phases, involved no revolution in Wordsworth's mental life. ऐसा किसी ने कहा भी है, ऐसा हमने पढ़ा भी है किसी बुक में. And it is correct also, because the ideal that were very much near and dear to Wordsworth were proclaimed anew in France. So Wordsworth we can say heartily, with full heart, hailed the French Revolution and also wrote about this in the poem, the great poem, which is known as the Prelude. He has also written in the Prelude. If you remember those two very popular lines, students, which you can quote in your paper also, what are those two lines? Bliss was it that very popular lines. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Fine. So there was a great feeling of enthusiasm. So this enthusiasm of his younger heart in greeting the French Revolution was actually like the aching joys, was like the dizzy raptures that filled him, that filled Wordsworth in the presence of nature. And yes, the romantic poets, or particularly Wordsworth, felt elated, felt exhilarated at the thought that the revolution was making the end of an era, and that too an era of tyranny, and was ushering in a period of peace, a period of equality, and even brotherhood of mankind. So for these romantic poets, for the poets of the revolution, which brought the promise of a new and glorious era in the lives of the human beings all over Europe. So in this question, you can quote certain lines again as per your, the sentences, the few lines which are important for in the poets to remember from the originals, which can give you more marks also. And as far as the romantic poets are concerned, these romantic poets now became basically interested in understanding the sorrows and the sufferings of man, and nature for which they were known, it retired to a second place. The first place was taken by the sorrows and the sufferings of mankind. So all his love was now actually given to the cause of man, and he felt in his heart, of his heart, that spirit, that feeling of humanity, working for the betterment of humanity, and he was all given to the people, and his love was theirs. I can say that had Wordsworth lived for some more days in France, he would have written songs in praise of that revolution and might have ended his life as a martyr to freedom. But you know what happened? He was called back to England in 1793. And on his return to England, when he returned, he came back to England, his faith in the revolution remained for some time unshaken. बिल्कुल कोई हिला नहीं पाया. But in course of time, there were to come to him rude awakenings from the dream that now filled his imagination. The massacres did something towards it. The horrible carnage, the bloodshed, and so many other things filled the mind of the poet with feelings of deep revulsion, with disgust for the French Revolution. And the revolutionists who were now turning the ideals of the revolution for extinction of the innocent humanity in France, and his sufferings were much increased when England took up arms against France. Yes, but you know what happened? His soul was still more harrowed when he saw France, which he had imagined stood for freedom, appearing as the ruthless destroyer, all that is good and noble, and degenerating from a champion of liberty into an oppressor of humble people. So he expressed his state of his life, his mind, in that great autobiographical poem that is the Prelude. So for this, you can even go through some lines of the Prelude also. And कुछ समय के लिए, for a certain time or for a time, there was chaos in his soul. He felt gloomy. He felt utter desolation. He turned away in disgust from politics. And it was only slowly and steadily that he succeeded in casting off the gloom, the despair that now was settling over his soul, and won his way through the agency of his sister Dorothy and Coleridge to peace, tranquility of mind, and try to acquire a nobler faith in the power of nature and confidence in human nature, because nature gave him some comfort. Simple life of the peasants, of the shepherds, of the highland girls, and the rural folk restored to him his lost faith in the goodness of human life. So there are two convictions, students, which penetrate, Wordsworth's work. Pehla, the dignity of man in himself, and the moral and the intellectual strength which come to him in communion with nature. The first, which I have told you, was the common possession of the revolutionary period, and the second, which I told you, he shared with Rousseau. But Wordsworth interpreted both these things with a very subtle profundity, entirely his own. Both in nature and in man, he saw the hiding places of infinite power. And sometimes the one, sometimes the other seemed to be the focus of his own thoughts, of his own mind. यहाँ तक कि जो humanity है, वो humanity, it basically rose a lot in his esteem. And this became a teacher, this became a consoler. And the ideal of the revolution, that is the simple, the good man, the clear mind, was all before him. And if we talk about the vagrants, the beggars, the peasants, he found those qualities which gave Rome her empire in the ancient world. 2 or 3 examples may be taken from Wordsworth's sketches of these lowly teachers. The first example I remember, there is a poem known as The Leech Gatherer, Leech. The Leech Gatherer. The leech gatherer tells the poet that he gains a livelihood by roaming the moors and gathering the leeches from the ponds. And they are much scarcer, the old man says, than they used to be. And I still remember that line while discussing this poem, The Leech Gatherer. Yet still I preserve and find them where I may. And still I persevere, and still I persevere and find them where I may. So with this message, the old pauper, Pauper, the old pauper on the lonely moor has won a place beside the great heroic figures of history, of epic or drama. And the fourth book of the Prelude closes, there are many books of the Prelude. So the fourth book of the Prelude closes with an account of a meeting with a ghostly figure dressed like a soldier. And the poet got a shelter for him in a cottage and entreated him that in future he would not linger in the public highways but would ask for help whenever he needed it. And there is a poem, The Old Cumberland Beggar. So the old Cumberland beggar is a kind of good angel. He keeps unselfishness alive and continues the traditions of charity. His thake hue pair, his very steps as he goes on in his rounds have always that dramatic value of the song of the girl, which you remember in the Browning's Pippa Passes. And in the descriptions of humanity, there is a kind of magic purity to the Highland girl, the solitary reaper. She was a phantom of delight, are some of his best poems. If you remember the poem, The Brothers, The Leech Gatherer, yes, Michael, then The Ruined Cottage. It is basically the part from the great poem, The Excursion. These all certainly shows the best of Wordsworth's poetry of man. Yes. So this was about the impact of French Revolution on the English Romantic poets, specifying on Wordsworth. In the same way, you can take things from, Coleridge, Byron, and even others and make it an entire question. Though I have tried to give you the entirety to solve this question, taking into a specification Wordsworth into account. Now, one question which I wanted to discuss with you related to the Victorian age is understanding Victorian compromise. I will directly not come to make you understand Victorian compromise. Before coming directly to this topic, I will just give you certain, an understanding of the Victorian age. Though you might be knowing, though I have taught, but still, to deal with this question, I would just go back and get you some details of the Victorian age so that you can understand in continuity. So, the Victorian age, मैं यहाँ लिख भी देता हूँ. First, we will, in short, not in detail. The Victorian age is basically considered to be one of the most remarkable periods in the history of England. We all know. It was an era of, material affluence. It was an era of material affluence, political consciousness, political consciousness, uh, dramatic reforms, democratic reforms, industrial and mechanical progress, scientific, I have written in short, scientific advancement, social unrest, educational expansion, empire building, and religious uncertainty. Now, if you have these points, you can solve any questions. There were a number of thinkers who were very much satisfied, who were very well satisfied with the progress made by the Victorian people, made by the Victorians. While from a whole class of adverse critics could be heard a very scathing criticism of the values held dear by the Victorian people. And we already know that while Macaulay trumpeted the progress that the Victorians had achieved, Ruskin and Carlyle, Bulwer Lytton and Anthony Trollope, they raised frowns of disfavor against the soul-killing materialism of the age. They were not in favor. Carlyle himself, a hostile critic of the age. And this age basically, is compared with the Elizabethan age also. But whatever we say, whatever may be the defects of the Victorian way of life, we cannot deny the fact that it was in many ways a glorious epoch in the history of English literature. And the advancement which we saw in the field of poetry, in the field of prose, in the field of fiction was actually commendable and actually commendable. So students, the Victorian age, was essentially a period of peace, essentially a period of prosperity. But the few colonial wars that broke out during this period exercised little adverse effect on the national life. If you remember, there was a war known as Crimean War. The Crimean War, of course, it caused a stir in England, but its effect were soon forgotten, sab bhool gaye, and the people regained the normal tenor of their lives without feeling the aftermaths of war in their round daily activities. And in the earlier years of the age, the effect of the French Revolution was actually to be felt, and the effect, no doubt it was felt, and it had almost completely dwindled, and England felt safe from any, revolutionary upsurge, disturbing the placidity and disturbing and peaceful reign when Englishmen, secure in their island base, could complete the transformation of all the aspects of their industrial, commercial, the social life without taking any risk of the violent interruptions that gave quite different quality to the history of continental nations. So, finally, to conclude, we can say that it was an era when the war drum throbbed no longer and the people felt safe, secure in their island homes. So, with this, now we come to understand the Victorian compromise. See, students, जहाँ तक है अपनी study की, our study of the Victorian background, that is why this was important to discuss. Our study of the Victorian background or the Victorian age will actually not be complete without writing a few lines about the Victorian compromise. Now, Victorian compromise क्या है कि ये जो Victorians थे ना, they sought a happy compromise. ये basically ढूंढते थे कि एक happy compromise हो जाए. Compromise होता है something in between, ना हमारी ना तुम्हारी, चलो सबकी. So they were basically trying to sort a happy compromise when they faced with radical problems, and they were not willing to be dominated by one extreme viewpoint. And in that confusing issues, they struck out a pleasing compromise. So Victorian compromise was particularly perceptible in three branches of life. And where it was in the field of political life, there was a compromise between democracy. And while accepting the claims of the rising masses of the political aristocracy, equality also came in between. And while they were reposing their faith in the progress in the political sphere, they were not ready for the settled order of life. So, progressive, idealistic upsurges were disturbing, which were being reconciled with the conservative learnings for an established order of society. And in the field of religion and science, again we saw a satisfying compromise. मतलब religion और science के बीच में भी compromise was accepted. But the claims of old religion, जो old religion claim था, that was not at all ignored. But the Victorians took up a compromising position between faith of religion and doubt. Doubt कैसे? Because it was created by science. So there remains more faith in honest doubt, and believe me than in half the creeds. ये आपको लाइन याद होगी, उससे ये क्लियर होता है. There remains more faith in honest doubt, believe me than in half the creeds. They basically desired to be assured that all was for the best. सब कुछ अच्छे के लिए हो रहा है. And they desired to discover some compromise, which, while not outstanding their intellect and their reason, would nonetheless soothe their conscience and restore their faith. If not completely, at least sufficiently to allow them to believe in some ultimate purpose, and more importantly in the life which is after death. And in voicing out these doubts, in phrasing the inevitable compromise, Tennyson found, and he endeavored passionately to fulfill his appointed mission. As far as in the field of sex, the Victorians had their again compromise. The sex problem was the most blatant and persistent, however, and in this field, their object was to discover some middle path, some middle course between the unbridled licentiousness of the previous ages and the complete negation of the function and the purpose of nature. So the Victorians permitted indulgence in sex but restricted its sphere to conjugal felicity, married life, and passion and illegal gratification of, matlab they were not in favor of the physical passion and the illegal gratification of sex impulse. So they could not contemplate basically, the possibility of any relation between man and woman other than conjugal relationship. If you see in Tennyson's Lady of Shalott, we are introduced to two young lovers walking in the moonlight, but we are at once reassured by the statement that these two lovers were lately wed. So the Victorian ideal was actually to achieve the wedded bliss, rather than the satisfaction of the sex urge by the illegal and the unauthorized methods. So this is in totality about the Victorian compromise at so many stages. So once you understand the Victorian age, Victorian compromises becomes easy to understand. Thank you.